All right, good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to our July 25th meeting and call it in order. Let's go ahead and start off with a very important and a brief moment of silence for our fallen since we've last met. We've had a number of our members pass, and a couple just notably in the last week. So we'll take a minute to remember our fallen brothers and sisters. All right, thank you. All right, so before us, we have our first item of business is the approval of our minutes from our June 20th meeting. They have been posted for our review. Entertain a motion to adopt. Motion's been made. Is there a second? Motion's been made and seconded to adopt our minutes. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. Motion carries and the minutes are adopted. Our second item of business is an annual update by Department of Retirement Systems. And good morning, Tracy. Turn it over to Tracy. Go ahead, Steve, if you got something.
Just by brief way of introduction, the department shares with the board every year how they're doing as far as benchmarking. That presentation is separate from this, and this is the update on all the different activities that DRS is working on.
I'm going to roll over so I can actually see you. I'm not tall enough, apparently. Something's going wrong. Good morning. Thank you for having us to give you an update on what we're up to today. I'm Tracy Guerin. I'm the director of the Department of Retirement Systems, who administers your firefighter plan and law enforcement plan. So I have a lot to go over today. I'm going to be pretty brief on most of the slides because you're pretty familiar with it, but there are a few areas I'd like to take a little deeper dive just because I think you have a particular interest. If I can get this up. Okay, so you guys are familiar with what we do. We have a lot of members. We have about $3.6 billion in contributions. We have about $4 billion going out in benefits. But specifically for your members, we have about 17,600 active, and we have 5,140 annuitants, and we have $214 million paid out in benefits to your members across the state of Washington. And we actually have now a map that shows by county how much money is paid out to your members across the state. So of that money, about $30 million of it goes out of state, but the rest of it stays in the state of Washington, so a little less than $200 million. You have a lot of buying power out there. And with regard to the department, we stay pretty steady at 250 team members. We are in one facility that we're looking to remodel, so we'll be asking for a budget request to actually do some remodeling to fit a few more team members in there. We do a lot of phone calls. Our goal is to answer all of our calls in 30 seconds. We do that about 75% of the time. But if you look at it against our peers, we actually do pretty well. They average about 164 seconds. We average about 87 seconds to get to a phone call. So we feel like we're doing good in the customer area. And then with regard to walk-ins, our goal is to meet and greet every person in 5 minutes and get them on their way with any assistance that they require. We do that about 75 to 85% of the time. And our average is 4.6 minutes, and our peer average is about 8 minutes. So again, we have high customer service levels. And as Steve said, we'll talk to you more about that later on in the year, about our benchmarking. But we do remain low cost and high service at about $61 per member. I think as I go through the presentation, you'll see with a lot of the initiatives we're looking at, one of the things I think you'll see in the benchmarking going along is that we will become a little bit higher cost. I don't think we'll be high cost because we're low cost now, but I think our costs will go up as we bring in new technology and new team members to maintain these high customer service levels. With regard to education and outreach, as you'll remember, last year I talked to you about webinars, and we started doing them at the beginning of the year. And it's had a really good uptake. We have very good attendance on that. What we try to do is reach members at all areas of the retirement journey. So we want to get members maybe after they've been 5 or 10 years to start thinking about retirement. How do they plan for retirement? So we're trying to do different kinds of workshops across the state, different days of the week, weekends, different times during the day, so that we can really reach those members like yours who work different shifts than 8 to 5 like some people do. So hopefully you're getting good reports on that. DCP automatic enrollment, I want to talk a little bit about that because we do have local governments participating in this. And local governments can choose to enroll in the automatic enrollment. So this is when an employee comes on, they're automatically enrolled for a 3%. They can opt out. They have 6 months to do that. But as you can see, we're getting almost a 90% uptake rate on that. So very few people are opting out. So we're really looking at a retirement readiness factor for employees so that they don't just have their pension benefit, but they've got another nest egg in DCP that they can draw upon. That's a tax-free way of getting in. So this is new state employees. I don't have data on local, but I'm going to try to get that so next time I visit with you, I can talk to you specifically about some of your members. I do know that 315 of the local governments do not participate in our DCP automatic enrollment, or rather DCP program. I'm hopeful that they do have something now for your members that they can participate in, even if it isn't the state one. So talking a little bit about our future, this is some of the things that we're looking at. This does not include the items that we'll be asking for in our budget request to the governor. But as I talked about earlier, we're hoping for a facility renovation. We're looking at modernization planning, which I'll talk to you a little bit more in the next couple of slides, and that's really around information technology and making things easier for our employers and for our customers. Of course, the Dolan implementation, that still is on appeal, but we do have pieces of it we need to implement. And then we'll talk about the ones on the bottom with regard to the legislative projects in just a minute. So with regard to implementing legislation, the one-time benefit adjustment for certain TERS and PERS retirees, that's in flight right now. We have the additional employers and job types membership into PSERS, that is mostly state employees. The one that you would be interested in, of course, is the option for McNeil Island. We have actually sent everything out for all the members have been notified, so they can make their election, and we hope to have that by the end of August with their return notifications. And then with the option for the hospital EMTs to enter LEV 2, we've been having some challenges with some of our employers in terms of getting the data, but we have been notifying members, and we've made some calls to the leaders of those organizations, and we're still trying to get the data. We've talked to some of your members who are very concerned because we can't get the data and can't give them a bill. We know that that's an issue that's out there. We're working it. We're kind of running out of options to work with the employers, so doing our best just to notify the members so that if they choose to do a bill later downstream, they have at least told us that they're thinking about that. So we're trying to put placeholders in for them while we're trying to get the data so they don't miss that cutoff. So we talked to Steve about this quite a bit. Modernizing our legacy systems. So this is really a program that'll probably be an 8 to 10 year program to look at all of our different systems within the agency that support our employers and support our customers and support our team members. So the first module that's rolling out is the employer reporting application. And what this will provide is some additional screening that employers can do before they actually submit their file, which is the basis for all of our collections, so that they can audit themselves and see if they have errors before we get it, so that they'll be able to self-correct before we get it and correct in flight rather than later dates. They're pretty excited about it. We have an early adopter group who will actually roll on to the system the beginning of September, so just about a month away. It includes 5 employers. The very first one is the Pasco School District, so we're starting with smaller employers, and then we'll work up to bigger ones. We have another rollout in October of another, I think, 9, and then another 10 in November, and then we'll roll out until we're done. We anticipate finishing by the end of 2019 with all employers. But we've had, we're in good shape. I feel really good about where we're at. We have very few bugs that we have left to fix. We have no level 1, so no high severity bugs. The employers have been being brought along as we've been building the system. So I'm hopeful for a very smooth rollout. It won't be any of your employers on the first round, but we'll let Steve know when some of your employers will be rolled on to the system. And then we'll be planning for our other legacy systems. So the next rollout we'll be asking for in the governor's budget that we'll be submitting at the beginning of September. And this will be really about taking our old mainframe system and getting off that and getting on to more modern systems. Our systems, they predate Plan 3, if you can imagine that, and Plan 3 is 23 years old. So that's the kind of technology we're working with, which I can't believe Plan 3 is 23 years old. I'm in it. And I'm like, what? I'm that old? I've been doing this how long? So we really do need to replace them, but it's going to be a long drive on it. And so again, I want, especially you guys, to understand that you may see some fluctuation in our costs, and it's due to things like this and the facility renovation. But we'll keep you posted on what comes next. Safeguarding our customers. It seems like every day I get up in the morning and I watch the news or read the newspaper and hear about some other entity that's been breached, right? And my data has been exposed I don't know how many times. I have credit monitoring because identity theft because my data was breached with Equifax, and I don't want that to happen to our customers. And so we work really, really hard to safeguard their data. We work very hard with our outside vendors like Empower, who actually provides the services for Plan 3 and DCP to make sure that there's no exposure on their side. And we had them come out and speak to the select committee a few months ago, I guess. And we just realized that there are some other things we can be doing on our side in order to beef up our security. So we are putting in a budget request to do that. And one of them that you'll hopefully not be too surprised, but surprised, is that we don't have a chief information security officer. We have someone wearing multiple hats. And when we're talking $4 billion coming in and $4 billion going out, we should have somebody dedicated to that. So that's one of the things that we will be asking for, along with some tools for our security staff to use. So I think that's a really important step. I'm very hopeful that the governor and the legislature agrees that we need to secure that data, those funds, make sure we don't have any breaches. We don't want to be on the front page of the paper. Strengthening our customers' experience. This is for the Plan 3 folks. So they can now go in and take additional information where they have savings or other investments, load it into that system, and see what their estimated retirement income will be. So again, this is around retirement readiness, and hopefully people start looking at it, not when they're 2 years from retirement, but maybe I'd go 10. I'd take 10 and call it a win if they start thinking about it 10 years before they're ready to retire, and really thinking about how is their money working for them and what will that look like for them when they retire, to make sure that they do have what they need to live how they want to live in retirement. The other thing is for DCP accounts. So now we have auto enroll, so we have almost a 90% stick rate. So now all those folks also have access to this tool so that they can go out, load in their Plan 2 retirements or their Plan 1 retirements, their other money from outside, and actually look and see if they're going to be at 80% or 70% or 60% when they retire. So I'm excited about this coming online. It was in April that this rolled on. Actually getting some really good comments about it, too, from members who are using it. They're really appreciating it. Supporting our team members. This, of course, if we have happy team members, we have happy customers because we're providing great service. So a couple of things I think I shared with you before was we implemented flex schedules, so team members don't have to work 8 to 5. They can come in early, stay late, depending on what their family requirements are or their personal requirements are. And then what we did this year, we implemented compressed work week. So now folks can work 410s or they can work 980s, which for a lot of, especially state employees, they're able to do that, and that was not something we had in our department. So getting a lot of really good feedback about that. People are able to take care of their family members. They might be taking care of parents or kids or something else, so I think they're really appreciating that. The other thing we did fourth quarter last year was we sponsored a DCI committee, so Diversity and Inclusion Committee. It's something that we haven't had, so since January, we got training in January for all team members, and then we started doing lunch and learn, so we've had a lot of different folks come and talk during lunch, and one of them was John Weiss, who's the Secretary of Department of Health, who happens to be a gay man, and he told his story of coming out and his parents and what that experience was like. We've had women come and talk about their experience being a mom and maybe a single mom and trying to work and have a career. So we've had some really great speakers and some great training. There's a lot of good information out there, and we've had a very good high interest rate in it. I think people are really interested in it. We have veterans come and talk. We had some tribal folks come and talk. So it's been really good exposure. And these are all people we serve. And so really understanding who they are and kind of being able to meet them where they are when they come in, I think is super important. So we're excited about that, and we'll continue on with that work. And then finally, possible legislation for 2019. thank you, Chair Lawson, for coming and talking at the Select Committee. So we're looking at spousal consent for survivorship selection. So I think I talked to you a little bit about this before. Right now, you have to have your spouse sign and notarize, get a notarized document for over 50%. So 66.7%, I think the next number is 75, and then 100%. It's crazy. It's like, why would you have to do that? We have people retiring online. They love doing it, and yet they have to go get this one document notarized and send it in. And so we just think, why would we make people do that? Why don't we make them do it if they're going to do something less than 50%, which we're a community property state, you're going to get 50% anyway. I think we all have conversations with our spouses before we do it, so I don't think we need to be paternalistic in our behavior. So we're hopeful that the Select Committee votes that out in September. The other one that we're pretty excited about is the annuity purchase option. So as you saw with those deferred comp numbers, being that high, when this next generation goes out to retire, they're going to hopefully have a nice little nest egg in deferred comp. And so we have annuity purchase options for some of your plans, but we don't have them for PERS, CERS, and PSERS. So we want them to be able to take that deferred comp money, roll it over, buy a TAP annuity, and have that constant benefit coming through for them. So it would open it up for all members of our retirement systems. And then the third one is the month of death payments. And this is one where if you happen to pass away on November 2nd, we would then send your beneficiary a bill for the latter part of the month, for the 3rd through November 30th. I don't want to send out bills to beneficiaries because they got too much money because someone passed away on the 2nd of the month. We spend money getting that money back. I'm not sure it's the best way to respectfully treat our members. And the other thing that's really interesting is the healthcare authority is saying that then that causes problems. So a lot of times people have their healthcare payments come directly out of their retirement checks. And then their health care gets messed up, so the beneficiaries are left without health care, and you were alive for 2 days during the month, and so you might not have been covered because your health care doesn't get paid. So it's just causing a lot of problems that are even outside just being respectful and what I think is sort of bureaucratic. So we're again hopeful that those two will come out of the Select Committee in September for consideration by the legislature. And that was pretty quick. I did pretty good. Do you have any questions? Okay.
Maybe I've heard it, and maybe I haven't. The Dolan implementation?
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Oh, the Dolan. You don't know about the Dolan. Okay, so
Probably do if I
Dolan
heard
is where there were some contracted, what are they called? Public defenders, the public defenders up in King County, and it turns out that there was a lawsuit filed by Mr. Dolan, and they were brought into the system. And so now there's King County made in arrangements with them in order to, they had a settlement with them basically where the state had to pay for them to be in the system. So we're spending a lot of money bringing them in the system. In short order. I mean, it's sort of a long story. I can talk to you about it offline. I don't want to go too far here. Other questions?
I would like to just make a brief comment. Thank you and your team for the cooperation. I know that interagency coordination starts at the top, and so this may be my one time to thank you publicly for your leadership and helping our two agencies work better together. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, we appreciate the partnership. Thank you.
All right.
3.
Next up is rate setting, and that is a three-part process. First, as you were learned earlier, the valuation that was done by the State Actuary's Office, which is the basis for the rates, is audited by an outside actuarial firm. This year, as in the past couple of rate-setting cycles, the audit was done by Milliman, and the team from Milliman is here to share with you the results of their audit and any questions that you might have. For board members who've been around, you will recognize this team's been consistent, and so all of these gentlemen have been here before, but I'll turn it over to Mark to introduce your team and let us know what you have planned.
Thank you, Steve. It is a pleasure to be here. I am Mark Allman. This is Dan Wade on my left, Nick Collier on my right. And I wanted to start off today by giving you two pieces of good news, not good and bad news, but two pieces of good news. The first piece of good news is that the results of our audit are good. The second piece of good news is that when the results are good, our presentation tends to be short. So actuaries just can't say that something looks good too many times, so that's going to be a certain limiting factor on us. Now, one sec here. The second good news is hopefully or the third that I can advance this. So, in the reason that we do the actuarial audit is to confirm that the results of OSA's evaluation are reasonable. Specifically, we do what's called a full and independent replication audit of the June 30, 2017 valuation, which means we really go from nuts to bolts. We take the same data from DRS, the same assets, the same assumptions, and we go through the entire this entire valuation process independently to come up with the same results, so that ultimately we can verify the information which you are using to set contribution rates. So again, the good news is that OSA's work is indeed reasonable and appropriate. We had a very good match on both the liabilities and the contribution rates. As you will see, the assumptions are reasonable. We have no outstanding issues from our prior audit of 2 years ago, which means that our recommendation is not to make any changes to the 2017 valuation which OSA performed for LEF. So I will pass it on to Nick and then Dan to go over the results and the process with you. Oh, and please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop us along the way. We're always happy to take questions as we go.
Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, this is a full replication. So as he noted, we're basically performing the same calculations that the state actuary did in their valuation process. And an actuarial audit is not exactly the same as an accounting audit. It's not as black and white. Given the myriad of calculations and the nuances and the different valuation systems we use, we don't expect to have an exact match, but we do expect a fairly high level of consistency, and we definitely found that with this audit. Looking at the results here, first we look at the present value of all future benefits. So that's the value of benefits expected to be paid for current members for all current and future service. That's used in the calculation of the normal costs under the aggregate method. As you see, if you go to the bottom of the box here, the top box, you see that OSA's numbers are $13.67 billion and ours are $13.69 billion, so that's a very high correlation, so we're very pleased with that result. That's a 99.9% ratio. We also look at the entry age normal accrued liability. That's the value of benefits allocated to service as of the valuation date, so a smaller number than the previous number. That number is used for reporting funded ratio and also in the GASB financial reporting. Once again, a very good match at 99.6% there. So you should have a very high level of confidence in the calculations provided to you by the Office of the State Actuary. So next we looked at the important thing, which is the contribution rates. We looked at this two ways. First of all, we matched OSA's calculation, their calculated contribution rates using their liabilities and normal cost rates from their valuation. This is more of a black and white calculation. We'd expect to match exactly, and we did on that because there's a lot less moving parts in that calculation. Next, we did the same calculation, but using our liabilities and normal costs, which I said was a very close match, but not an exact match. And you see that in the contribution rates there for the member, employer, and state all match within a few basis points. And we note we showed the rates based on the 90% of the entry age normal cost method. I think you're going to hear after our presentation of setting your contribution rates. You could use this. We use this just because the state actuary, that's what they reported. We're not recommending it, but obviously it would be a reasonable approach. But you're going to have other options, and we'll leave that to your next speaker.
And as we like to say, if we match at 90%, we will also match at 100%.
So obviously the reliability of the valuation results are dependent on the input to the valuation. This shows the 4 key components. We reviewed each of these for reasonableness, and Dan will talk about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Segueing to me, yes, I'm Dan Wade. Thank you, Mark and Nick. And those puzzle pieces, they really are critical because, as you all know, with any mathematical model, if you have garbage in, what's going to follow is garbage as well. But we're here to report that there's no garbage, so you can feel good about the results that Nick went through. And the first of those pieces of the puzzle that I'm going to discuss is the membership data. And for that, we took the data supplied by DRS, the exact same data files that were provided to the Office of the State Actuary, and we looked at those and we reviewed them for reasonableness. We also reviewed them for consistency. For instance, Tracy brought up the benefit payments of $200 million. We looked at the benefit amounts and saw that indeed it would line up with that. We also confirmed that it was a comprehensive data file and had all the information necessary to do the calculations. And so then we edited that same data file for our valuation system, and we made a few little edits because we wanted to make sure the salary was reasonable for some very recent hires and wanted to exclude some outliers. But the bottom line conclusion is that we felt the data used by the Office of the State Actuary looks very good. And if we go to the next slide, I've got the mouse. I'm driving. So, yes, as you can see, all
I
of
can
them.
be co-pilot.
Okay, thank you. Yes. All of the items line up with just a small difference for the average salary, and even that lines up to a very close match. The second and third pieces to the puzzle are the benefits provisions, and we looked at the benefits being valued and looked at the RCW as well as the member handbooks, and indeed the benefits valued by the Office of State Actuary were aligned with those. The next piece of the puzzle, the methods and the actuarial assumptions. We did a full review back in 2014, the first time that we did this audit, and we went through every single assumption at that time. Now, for the most part, the demographic assumptions from that time have been in place since then, and we didn't review them at this time, but the economic assumptions did change. And we did take a look at that and assessed our thoughts about that. The inflation assumption went from 3% to 2.75%, just a little lower, and that's very much in line with what other systems are doing, and it's very much in line with what we're recommending that our clients do, and so no concerns there. There are plenty of reasons for that. The downward trend is actually being seen nationwide, and so no real surprise or cause for concern there. That also meant that the salary growth projections are a little lower because that corresponds with the inflation. But now the most important of the economic assumptions, of course, is the investment rate of return assumptions that we use, that Nick was discussing to bring back those benefit payments to the present value. And that has been lowered from 7.5 to 7.4, very much in line with national averages, very much in line with the analysis done by the WSIB. So that gives us reason to feel that that was a good move. Just as one other little data point, Milliman has experts when it comes to investments and when it comes to setting capital market assumptions, and we took the allocation that is used by the retirement systems and then took it to our model, and we actually got a median of about 7%, and that's using our latest model. It was actually a little higher if we used the previous model. And so it shows there's still a downward trend, but that 7.4 is still very much in line with what we're seeing elsewhere. And the next slide. So the very last piece of the puzzle, the actuarial value of assets, this is the smooth value of assets that's used. And we took the same inputs that the state actuary had. You had information from both DRS as well as WSIB, and we took that information, and there aren't as many moving parts as there were for the liability calculations, but there are a few, and we matched the state actuary very well. I think we had 11.04 billion, and that's based on a market value of 11.72 billion. Both of those numbers are bigger than the past service liability that Nick discussed, and so that's a very good position to have. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mark, unless there are any questions at this time. Oh.
Mark?
Thanks. So, question about the valuation return on investment projection. Can you explain to me? You said with old numbers, old system, you had kind of two different sets of numbers.
Yeah, I
Can you-
didn't probably clarify that well. We have our latest and greatest model, our very most recent model, and that implied about a 7%.
And that was dated December 31.
Yeah, so that's the most recent model that we have. But we also
December
look.
31, 2017 assumptions.
We also had a model that was in place the year before, and the model we had in place the year before suggested a little bit higher than that 7.0 figure. Actually, a number between the 7.4 and the 7.0.
Yeah, and that model was dated June 30th, the valuation date.
Right. So that would be more in line with what the state actuary would have used and was selected by the board to be used based on the analysis of the state actuary and the WSIB.
follow-up? So what changed in your analysis? What changed that?
I think the main driver was actually that just looking at the price to earnings ratios, that's a factor, and there was a feeling that maybe I'm not. This is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, to be completely honest with you, but I think that the just because of the run up in the equities markets, we're expecting it to kind of regress to the mean for going forward. Yep. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, our investment actuary looks very closely at the price to earnings ratios, and as those change, he has a rolling period that he looks at, so that has a big impact. So in conclusion, we will leave it to you to decide whether or not the presentation was short enough, but we stand by our guns that the results are good, that you can have confidence in using OSA's 2017 valuation in your rate setting process, which I understand is up next. We certainly compliment the board and how stable you have managed to keep the rates over time. And we also want to voice our appreciation to the Office of the State Actuary for their assistance in our replication. They were extremely cooperative. They gave us everything we needed, and it was a pleasure working together with them. So if there are any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we will go on.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
You like good news.
Yes. So do we.
All right. When it comes time for rate setting, historically, the board has considered a range of different options. You heard some mention about two of those options already. The aggregate rate using the 90% floor, which is sometimes used, the Office of the State Actuary calls that the statutory method, and the board's longstanding practice of using 100% of the expected long-term cost. Ryan is going to run through all the different options that are available and answer any questions that you have. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve, members of the board. For the record, Ryan Frost, Senior Research and Policy Manager. So before we get into the rate options, first is the funding method options presentation. And so the issue here is that there's a variety of funding methods used to estimate the cost of future benefits. Therefore, it's up to the board to decide which method aligns best with their funding goals. So the aggregate cost method is the statutory funding method for all the open plans, including Left Plan 2. However, the board has used a temporary funding policy for much of its history. So that creates some confusion because when the actuary's office presents to the board, they'll point to the aggregate as being the long-term method or the statutory method for funding the plan, even though the board has not used that method when setting rates for the past 10 years. Another piece to how, or why the board has not used that method is because the board was created right after a market crash at a time when rates were out of bounds with what the expected long-term cost of the plan was. I have a chart later in the presentation that shows kind of the ramp up in rates that the board adopted. So right before that market crash, the board adopted a temporary funding method to set rates at 100% of the long-term expected cost of the plan rather than use the aggregate method. So why is a funding policy important? Well, a funding policy is very important to the success of a pension plan because these policies will help address the plan's affordability, the risk of the plan, rate stability, and rate adequacy. While the funding method is the underlying rate calculation, any funding policies the board actually adopts is layered on top of that. And the board has stated the following goals as plans in their funding policy. stable contribution rates, full funding on an ongoing basis, smoothing the investment returns, setting an asset value corridor, setting minimum contribution rates, as well as adopting multi-year rate plans. And I'll speak about each of these in a little bit. As far as the funding method, the choice of funding method is a core issue for a pension plan because the funding method determines the way the cost of the plan will be financed over time in much the same way that the choice of a style of mortgage determines the way in which the cost of a house is financed over time. All standard funding methods will accomplish the same goal of completely funding the cost of the plan, just like either a fixed rate or adjustable rate mortgage. And then I'll also go over the aggregate method a little bit, describe the entry age normal cost method, and then finish describing what the board's funding method has historically been. So stable contribution rates. These are important because they create predictable budgets for employers, employees, and other stakeholders. And the board has adopted policies to moderate short-term swings in these contribution rates with, as I mentioned, investment smoothing, an asset value corridor, minimum rates, multi-year rate plans. For the smoothing investment returns, the current assumption is that assets in the Left Plan 2 retirement fund will earn 7.4% over the long term. However, on a year-by-year basis, that return is almost certain to be higher or lower than 7.4%, which results in a gain or loss when compared to that earnings expectation. So what public pension funds commonly do is they smooth the phase-in the recognition of these gains or losses over a period of time in order to soften the effect of short-term financial volatility on the rates. So the greater the deviation from 7.4, the longer period those will be smoothed over a period of up to 8 years for Left Plan 2. An asset value corridor. So smoothing investment returns results in a variance between what the true market value of the assets are in the retirement fund and the assumed value, which is used to determine the contribution rates for the plan. So the corridor ensures that the variance stays within a set amount, which increases contribution rate stability during periods of unusual investment gains or losses. Left Plan 2 uses a 30% corridor, which means the actuarial value of assets can't fall below 70% or above 130% of the market value. I'm going to skip ahead because I have a chart. There's a question, I think, from Representative Bergquist about historically what that's looked like for the plan. Let me get to it. So here's the historical corridor and how the market value has compared to the actuarial assets value of assets, and you'll see that the actuarial value of assets has been much less volatile than the market value, but they've constantly stayed within that corridor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is the corridor is kind of meant to weather smaller storms? Is that kind of usually my understanding? And there was a little concern when I was at the CAP training that our corridor is quite wide. If you look at that 2007, when the market did crash quite considerably, we still didn't even come close to kind of encroaching on the corridor. I'm trying to figure out, is that what the corridor is meant for, or how does that really work?
Well, that's a fair question. So if you look at the slide for 2009, you'll see that although we didn't go out of the corridor, we were literally right on the edge. And so it was the market rebound that kept that inside the corridor after that. That was a question that came up after the market crash is, if you stayed within the corridor, even during an event as big as that, is the corridor working? Part of it was, if you can kind of look at the lead up to the corridor, you were in a good spot. So you had a couple of things working for you. Definitely one of the things was the width of the corridor. If that had been a 20% corridor, you would have seen rates go up more than they did. Since then, you've had this long, sustained run-up in the market since 2008, and you've been almost, then you can see now, dead set in the middle of the corridor. At this point in time, I don't know how big a concern it is, but yes, it would take it would take some kind of extraordinary shock to fall outside of the corridor anytime in the near future.
I mean, is that the intention, is kind of my question, or is it supposed to be more of a, real smoothing number, and should it go, above that 20%, should we be realizing those gains or losses more quickly? I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there.
That type of policy question would be one that you guys could talk about at the strategic planning in October. For now, the point I didn't make very well is that was a question in 2009 and 2010. I don't want to, because of the way the markets have performed since then, nobody put a lot of emphasis on that question. And to the extent that, let's just say hypothetically, I don't want to bring doom on us, but hypothetically there was another recession similar to what happened in 2009. Then that question would become a lot more relevant immediately, where you would have to decide, okay, even with the 30% corridor, we don't need to raise rates, but would a 20% corridor be, and a corresponding rate increase? Where you're at now, you're on the plus side of the market, so the more likely to hit the ceiling at this point in time. But part of that is because we've had this historically long run-up. That can't continue forever. The main takeaway, you can see, especially since 2010 and 11, how you've been well-centered in the middle of that. For a lot of plans, their news, they would be looking at a much gloomier chart than the one that you're looking at if they were considering this. You've done the decisions you made in 2010 turned out to be very, you guys could almost see the future. The markets, the rebound in the markets, the investment returns, the assumptions that you've adopted ended up in an extraordinary healthy place.
Go ahead, Patrick.
One of the things, isn't this, the corridor was set to reduce the panic and shock because of the idea that if you narrow the corridor, there's more chances of the plan not looking that it's been funded at the right level, and then people start panicking to either increase or decrease the benefits or the contributions. So this corridor is in relation to how the State Investment Board is investing also, the confidence of the investment board, because isn't this where we get our run-up?
Yeah, partly yes. Originally, it started in the late 90s, so there was a great run-up in the market, and there were assets being smoothed. The funded ratios of all the plans were looking extraordinarily healthy, and people were trying to figure out, should we spend that surplus?
Correct.
Then the market crashed and so that you were looking at, what do we do at closer to the top of that corridor, the 130% rather than the 70? The board, the market crashed in 2001, and one of the things that the board did early on was say, what could you guys learn from the 2001 crash to prepare for the next one, whenever it is? And one of the things that always strikes me is the board you adopted your long-term policy in July of 2008, 5 months before everything broke loose for everything else. And then you stuck with it. the next year and the next year, which is what you see on this slide. The timing of that, like I said, it couldn't have been better. It's one of the reasons why you're the only plan that came out of the recession the way you did. But at different times, whether it's the market run-up in the late 90s, the crash in 2001, and then the Great Recession in 2008, you've been closer and higher. The performance of the SIB has been extraordinary, particularly compared to peers. One concern, if you will, with respect to rates, is that the volatility in investment performance, earning 7.4 over time. Not in me personally, I think the SIB is going to do that, but they might do it by 4% one year, 12% the next year. That volatility, the corridor helps manage that volatility. Yeah.
Okay, so the next funding policy is minimum contribution rates, and these are often referred to as a rate floor. And what they're used for is to ensure that short-term contribution rates do not drop below the expected long-term cost of the plan by more than a set amount. Left to adopted 90% of the expected long-term cost of the plan as the contribution rate floor. However, as I mentioned, over the past 10 years, the board has decided to just adopt at that 100% of the expected long-term cost of the plan, so this rate floor has not come into play at all. And lastly is the multi-year rate plans. This is another method to improve the predictability of rates, because the board has chosen when they adopt rates that they will adopt rates for the next 2 bienniums rather than just for the following 2 years. So when rates come due, so for the 2017 interim, for example, the board adopted rates for 2017, 2019, and 2019, 2021. So now to get into the funding methods. First, I want to talk about the aggregate funding method, because that is the method in statute currently, even though the board has chosen not to use it. This method has only one component, the normal cost. The normal cost takes the cost of all future benefits and spreads that over the current membership. It promotes a long-term stability in contribution rates because it's designed to fund the cost of the plan as a level percentage of pay over a member's working career. The rates paid by the plan members and their employers would theoretically remain unchanged for the member's entire career if the plan's long-term economic assumptions and assumptions regarding member behavior were 100% accurate. But to the extent that those assumptions prove inaccurate, any difference between what is expected and what is experienced, such as lower than expected investment returns, is reflected in the plan's cost each time the plan is reviewed and a new long-term rate is calculated. Therefore, short-term rates can and do experience ample volatility. A plan using the aggregate funding method will always be 100% funded. However, if the acquired contributions are paid, it will never have a surplus or an unfunded liability. And because the plan has a surplus, that's one way of seeing that we have not used the aggregate rate for some time. The second method is the entry age normal cost method, and this method has 2 components. It has that normal cost component, but it also has an unfunded actuarial accrued liability. That UAL refers to the difference between the actuarial value of assets owned by the plan and the total benefits due to be paid. Unfunded liabilities are created when the actual plan investment returns are less or more than the assumed returns, and when other plan assumptions are realized, which results in an actual cost exceeding or below the predicted costs. And both of these components, the normal cost and the UAL, are necessary in this funding method to achieve the goal of fully funding the benefits when they're due. The normal cost is more stable under entry age because it doesn't include any of the experience that differs from assumptions. That's what the UAL component is for. So the normal cost will only change when the plan assumptions are changed. And lastly, what the board has decided to do over the last 10 years. The board has 2 policies in place when it comes to the funding method, as I mentioned. Long term, the board has the aggregate funding method in statute with a rate floor of 90% of the entry age normal cost. But short-term, the board has decided to just adopt rates at that 100% of the long-term expected cost or the entry age normal cost. And the funding policy behind that is actually a variation of that, because the board has decided to simply ignore the UAL component of entry age normal cost. So you have tied the rates to that normal cost, but you have allowed any of that unfunded liability or surplus, in Left 2's case, to fluctuate based on investment returns. And this has actually provided the most stable rates out of all of those three methods. Here's a chart showing what the adopted rates by the Left 2 board has been in comparison to what the intrage normal cost method rates were and what the aggregate cost method rates were. And you'll see that the board has adopted and seen much more stable rates than either of those funding methods would have provided. So that brings us to our policy options in front of you today. The first option would be to just continue to use the funding method, two funding methods, where short term you will simply adopt 100% of the intrage normal cost as you've done, but long term in statute and in your long term policy will still be aggregate with a 90% intrage normal cost floor, which means every time I come to you with rates, I'll be presenting aggregate with 90% floor as well as what you've historically done. Or the second option would be to change your long-term method to what the board has done for the past decade, which is the 100% of the intrage normal cost. And then the board can decide how they would like to manage that UAL. You can continue to simply allow that to go up and down with experience of investments, or you can choose to amortize that surplus or implement a funding ratio corridor. That can be a discussion later on in the interim or possibly next year. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Right?
This would be, so this is an action item. It would require a motion to adopt a funding policy. Otherwise, the option would be to continue using the two funding methods. So this is kind of a decision point for the board.
Be open for discussion, because right now, we currently use the number one.
Yes.
Correct. And by looking at the slide, I'm going to move up a couple, I think our history has shown, I think it's slide number 22 of Ryan's presentation. Is that correct, Ryan? Can you go back real quick, 22?
The comparison, yeah, that.
So that green line is us. That's our action based on option number one or current practice, correct?
Correct, yeah. The green is what the board has done for the last 10 years. And the blue would have been what would have happened to rates if the board adopted simply the intrage cost method.
Correct.
And then that darker line on the bottom would have been if the board adopted rates based on the aggregate cost method.
If that was if that chart was carried backwards to the beginning of the board, then you would see a little bit more of, for the board members who've been around and legislators who lived through it, the Happy Valley rate decreases and the
I have that chart in the next presentation too.
and
I
the
do,
Terror
yeah.
Mountain rate increases as they were coined by legislative staff. So you would see a little bit more of the volatility in some of the other rate methods than even you see on this slide. You'll also see that stair-stepped rate increase that the board implemented, that first temporary policy that you did back in 2004 to get to where you ended up there in 2008.
What would happen if we moved to number two? Just curious.
Number two would be a continuation of the policy that you've used since 2008.
Right?
It would have two outcomes. One, it would mean less reporting of multiple options. Ryan talked about that. And it will also require then some board discussion about how you want to manage unfunded liabilities, whether they're positive like they are currently or negative in the future. That discussion about how you want to manage unfunded liabilities could be a part of your October strategic planning or separate meetings this interim or next year. Ryan talked about that.
Thanks, Steve.
So, I mean, for example, when the state actuary would come in and talk to us, they wouldn't give us those 2 or 3 options. They would kind of go with what our funding policy is.
Yes, so currently, because your long-term statutory method is the aggregate method with a 90% floor, that's what OSA uses every time they report to you, and then we have to ask them to give the 100% floor numbers as well, because we know that that's been an important number for you over the last 10 years. Lisa, I don't know if you want to, if I'm doing okay, or if you want to come up and answer some of these questions as well, but also it may affect some of the fiscal note rate calculations. It would definitely affect the way some of the reporting is done in the future valuations. And if there's anything I'm leaving out or saying wrong, you correct me right now.
There are a few things. So for the record, Lisa Wan with the State Actuary's Office. So first, I just want to clarify that in statute is the aggregate funding method. Then the board has adopted 2 policies that are rate floors. So we come to you with the aggregate rates and your policies. And your policies, your rate floors, have always been higher than the aggregate rate in the years that we've been reporting to you. So those are still rate floors. And I'd be very comfortable with you deciding that you only want 1 rate floor versus 2. But if you moved to number 2 without an unfunded liability component, that is not an actuarial cost method. And the actuaries would have to comment on that in every valuation. So I just want to be very clear.
And that would be a negative from the actuary office.
It could come across that way, correct?
Which we do not have that problem at this point.
That's correct,
Okay.
because your 100% is a rate, your 100% entry age normal cost is a rate floor in combination with the aggregate funding method. So hopefully that's clear. And I did want to just make one comment on the graph. I just feel I have to comment on that because if you're looking at that graph and making a decision, I want to make sure you understand that that graph has a flaw in it, in that the entry age, not the corridor one, that one, yes. The aggregate or the entry age cost method, the blue line in there, we had to make assumptions about the unfunded liability component in order to do that. So it wouldn't really look that volatile. So I just wanted to clarify that. If you're making a decision based on how those graphs look, I wanted to clarify that it would not look that volatile if you had the full funding method in place. But because we didn't have it at the time we developed this chart a few years ago, we had to make assumptions, and the unfunded liability started at 0.
You see negatives with number 1? As far as reporting back, I mean, obviously you have 2 reports.
I don't see any negative with continuing with number 1, but I think it would be easier on the board if you chose your short-term or long-term and stuck with that, like one of those 2. Like if you maintain the aggregate funding method, which is in statute, and you would not have to change statutes, right? It's in statute, and then just land on either 90% or 100% of the normal cost as your rate floor. I think that would provide a lot more clarity for the board. And then we would be coming to you basically with 1 set of numbers instead of 2.
So if I'm getting the language wrong, but it would be like an option of adopting the aggregate method with a 100% floor.
Correct.
You see that language as different than number 2. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I just
So-
wanted to
So
clarify
then there
that.
might be like
I
3
wasn't-
options.
I wasn't positive if number 2 was moving you away from the aggregate funding method to the entry-age normal cost method. And if you were doing that, I just wanted to clarify that the entry-age normal cost method has 2 components, and if you just ignore one of the components, as actuaries, we would have to comment on that.
Yes, sir. Ade.
With either method, how often do we have to change rate?
You would still be faced with rate decisions at every rate setting process, which occurs every 2 years. So you would still be faced with that. But the board always has the option to not change the rates as long as what's being calculated in that rate setting process still remains reasonable with what you have
Assumptions.
adopted. Yes. So it's really a check-in. You know, we calculate the rates every 2 years for you, and then it's brought to the board, and you can still make decisions to say, we want to maintain where we're at. It falls within, you know, say the aggregate and this rate floor, but the stability of rates is more important to us. They're our highest goal, and so we're going to continue on the same road. That's always an option.
I was thinking maybe to make a motion to, and maybe help me along with that, but to kind of do option 3 where we maintain the aggregate funding method, but have the long-term or the 100% entry-age normal be our, is it long-term or short-term? Like
Floor.
Floor.
long-term.
Yeah, it would just be your new policy.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's what I would like to
We-
motion. I just don't know that I've done that correctly.
Yeah, so let me rephrase it, and then Lisa and you or any of the board can, but it would be to adopt the aggregate funding method with 100% floor as the funded method for the board.
That's correct. I would like to make that motion.
That,
Yeah, I
Right.
would just clarify in the language, the 100% of the normal cost under the
as the
entry
floor.
age.
Okay.
okay?
Okay. So moved.
Motion, we have a second. Discussion.
Go back to the same issue that we had. Would you have to identify the unfunded liability?
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, because we're staying aggregate, it just still has that one component.
All right, any other discussion? So, on the motion, Mr. Nelson, can you read it back, how you got it wrote down?
To adopt the aggregate funding method with 100% of the entry age normal cost floor as the long-term method, funding method for the board.
That work? All right. Seeing no other discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion is adopted. All right, number 5, Ryan.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. For the record, Ryan Frost, Senior Research Policy Manager, and this is your contribution rate setting options final presentation. So the purpose of contributions are to pre-fund any pension obligations. Members and employers make contributions to the pension trust fund during the member's working life as a percentage of their salary. These contributions are invested and grow with earnings, with the ultimate goal being that the accumulated fund at retirement should equal the cost of all future benefit payments. So in even numbered years, the board has a statutory duty to set rates for Left Plan 2. And these rates come in 2 forms, a base rate to pay for the cost of the plan and a supplemental rate to pay for the cost of additional benefits added to the plan. The board adopts the required rates for members, employers, and the state. They are split on a 50-30-20 basis, 50% of the contributions paid by the member, 30% by the employer, and 20% by the state. DRS then collects those required contributions on a monthly basis and transfers them to the Left 2 retirement fund. Prior to the creation of the board in July 2003, these base rates for Left 2 were set by the Pension Funding Council and subject to revision by the legislature. The PFC still receives those recommendations for all the other plans. And as I mentioned, there are two types of contribution rates. There's the base rate and the supplemental rate. The base rate is based on the level of benefits in place at the time the underlying actuarial valuation is performed. Base rates for Left 2 were established on an ad hoc basis prior to 1989, but generally were only changed every 2 years unless there was a benefit increase. As I mentioned, these rates are based on results of odd-year actuarial valuations, and these valuations, as happened today, are audited by an outside actuary with those results given to you. And these rates apply for the ensuing biennium, or as the board's funding, one of the board's funding policies has been the following 2 bienniums. And then the supplemental rate. So a supplemental rate contribution rate is calculated and charged whenever there's an increase to the benefits. It's performed by the Actuary's Office for all pension legislation, and the result of that calculation is reported in the fiscal note. Any supplemental contribution rate for Left 2 is adopted by the board, and the board has all rate recommendations audited by an outside actuary. One important distinction is that these supplemental rates are included in the base rate at the beginning of the next contribution rate setting cycle. But the supplemental rate is really intended to begin pre-funding the cost of a benefit improvement rather than waiting until the next actuarial valuation when the benefit liability will be rolled into that base rate. The risk of delaying the adoption of supplemental rate is that the loss of earnings on the contributions that would have been made. But a delay in the adoption of supplemental rate may not create a significant risk of underfunding depending on the cost of that supplemental rate. And in this case, you can see the numbers there. It's a rather low cost. And I'll go over the bill a little bit that was passed that had a supplemental rate attached to it. But first, I want to go a bit over the supplemental rate history that the board has either considered or adopted. The board's considered supplemental increases for 14 benefit improvements and adopted supplemental increases for 10 improvements, the last being in 2009 with the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Officer Service Credit Transfer. The last 4 benefit improvements with a cost, the board has simply decided to allow experience to play out rather than adopting a supplemental rate and allowing those rates to simply roll into the next valuation. So the fiscal note for Substitute Senate Bill 6214, which was the PTSD bill. What this bill did was added PTSD to the list of occupational diseases, and it created a rebuttal presumption for left members that PTSD is an occupational disease. OSA estimated in its fiscal note that this legislation would have a cost to the plan due to members who leave employment due to PTSD being eligible for disability or death benefits. They also stated that they do not expect the bill to result in an increase in the total number of annual deaths, but they do expect an increase in the total number of annual disabilities since the bill expands the coverage of occupational diseases. So those costs are outlined in the table below. I also this time have the budget impacts of these supplemental rates. And one important distinction that I want to make again is that the supplemental rate, if you chose to adopt it, would become effective in the rate on September 1st of this year. And that would be an increase in the member rate of 5 basis points, the employer rate of 3 basis points, and the state rate of 2 basis points. As I mentioned on that last slide, though, the board previously, over the last 4 benefit improvements, has simply chosen to not adopt a supplemental rate and allowed experience to play out and the base rate to begin the following July as normal rates are adopted. I talked about this a little bit in the funding methods options presentation, but strategic priority for the board is financial integrity, and that is to maintain a fully funded status of 100% or better, as well as adopt stable contribution rates with predictable increases. Some previous rate setting decisions that have contributed to that have all been adopted in your strategic planning meetings, which were the 4-year rates, setting a contribution rate floor, adopting those 10 supplemental rates, as well as adopting those multi-year rate plans. Here's that chart that Steve talked about a little bit earlier that showed at the time the Left 2 board was created, there was really a ramp up in contribution rates to where the board, the actuary's office, thought the long-term cost of the plan was. This is another requested chart, which is the estimated contribution rate path under each of the methods. And lastly, I want to get to the policy options before the board, which are continue current rates. The rates currently collected are sufficient to fund the cost of all benefits in Left 2 during the 2019-2021 biennium. The current rates are based on the 2015 actuarial valuation. They include subsequent temporary and supplemental rates prior to the 2018 legislative session, but they do not reflect the board's updated economic assumptions adopted during the 2017 interim. And that's really where you'll see the difference between our current rates and the recommended rates by the actuary's office. And those economic assumption changes, including lowering the discount rate, the general salary growth rate, and the inflation assumptions. If the board does continue to choose these rates, then no board action will be required today, since you've already previously adopted these rates through 2021. The second option, and this is again one of the options that must be presented because of how the funding methods are in statute, is the aggregate rate based on the 2017 valuation. So the aggregate rate determines the normal cost and the actuarial accrued liability, but under this method, the unfunded actuarial present value of fully projected benefits is amortized over the future payroll of the active group. And you'll see that this number is much lower than the other two rates. And the third option is to adopt rates based on aggregate with 100% entry age normal cost floor from the 2017 valuation results, which has been your policy for the last 10 years. And the preliminary contribution rate levels based on the 2017 valuation are lower than the rates currently collected, due in part, as I mentioned, because of those lower economic assumptions and changes in plan experience. So here are your three options. Current collected rates are option 1. That's the 875 member, 525 employer, 350 state. Option 2 is that aggregate 90% floor rate, which is 644-386-258. And the third option has been the board's historical funding policy, which is 100% entry age normal cost floor based on the aggregate rate, based on the 2017 actuarial evaluation. And one key distinction I want to make here is that the board also has the decision of when to adopt these rates. As I mentioned, there is that supplemental rate. So if the board would like to adopt these rates as of September 1st, 2018 to pre-fund some of these, that benefit improvement, you can see on the asterisk, it does include that supplemental rate increase in option 3. Or you can do what you've done with the last 4 proposed supplemental rate increases, which is just to allow experience to play out over those 10 months and adopt and have rates become effective the following July when they're normally become effective. And then there's budget impacts were requested for the two between the current adopted rates and the board's funding method that they have used. And you'll see that there's about a $3 million savings between option 1 and option 3. For the state, $4 million savings for local governments and a $7 million savings for employees. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Go ahead, Steve.
Question. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like the history of the board as of the past few decisions has been to kind of stay with what we've established and make a decision for the following year. Is that?
As far as the supplemental goes?
Yeah, so, yes. If you're talking about matching historically what the board's done, at least since since 2008, you would be looking at option 3. A separate decision is the supplemental rate piece. And if you adopted the supplemental rate what you would see is beginning in September, so let's use the member rate as an example. The member rate would go up from 8.75 to 8.8 beginning in September, and it would continue at that higher rate until next June, and then in July, the rate would drop down to 8.59. So what the board has done also the last several times it faced with a rate is you've done number 3, but you've ignored the supplemental rate increase. There's no need to spike rates for a short period of time, and you've just let that experience roll into the cost. So particularly for the last 4, if you were being consistent with what the board has done, you would do option 3 and no supplemental rate increase.
Revisit it in June or July.
You would probably revisit it the next rate setting, which would be in 2020. Yeah.
Steve or Ryan, looking back at past supplemental rate increases and seen, I guess my question is, what has been the experience there? Has the experience actually matched the need for those supplemental rate increases, or did we come in over or under? I mean, I don't know, you might not have that off the top of your head, but
For some of them, it's too soon to tell. There were some, for instance, there was a rate impact for catastrophic disabilities. Turned out to be less than the number of catastrophic disabilities turned out to be less than expected, and that's been reflected in experience since then. That's one where we've had more time. The PTSD right now, the actuary talked with you about their fiscal note earlier this interim. They had to develop some assumptions based on data from national sources. And it will be something that we'll continue to track as experience studies play out. So I couldn't really guess as to whether that one's going to be dead on or a little bit high or a little bit low. But the fiscal note for the bill was audited by an outside actuary, Marilyn Oliver. We did receive the report from Marilyn Oliver that the work done by the actuary was reasonable, and their calculations matched up with what OSA had calculated.
Ade, go ahead.
I think I just want to remind us, I think one of the greatest achievement of Left 2 Board is we've been able to maintain a predictable rate, which I think has been very useful to the employees, to the members, and to the employers in terms of planning. So as we move forward, having that kind of a predictability, I think is something that will be very useful, especially as we enter unpredictable time, because many economics are predicting recession or whatever it is. So having some degree of predictability for the state budgeting, for the city or employer budgeting, and even for the members to be able to count on what their income will be or their take-home pay will be, I think is something that we should really keep in mind as we move forward. Also, as I understand it, and I will be glad to be corrected, that our funding level, I think has been really reasonably, over the years, have been reasonably good. And I think whatever rate that we set needs to reflect that as well.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to probably confuse things here, but from a typical, nothing more than a 20,000 foot view. We've talked about a bunch of different things during the meeting here. We've talked about a buffer, a corridor of 30%. We've talked about expectations that the rate of return is going to be will drop over the next 50-year period, just not based upon expectations from 7.4 to 7%. Not long ago, we were sitting towards 9%. I mean, with expectations here. When you put all this stuff together, and as Ade just mentioned here, that yeah, we're hearing a little bit of a rumble. This is one of the longest run-ups in history we've actually had without a correction here. That, we're about due for a sine wave to happen here on this. If we do nothing and we sit on the current rates, as a matter of timing more than anything else, would it be prudent to do that, knowing full well that there's a potential for a correction here in the not too distant future, and rather than having adjusted rates right now, if we have the ability not to adjust rates right now, and there has to be a correction, it's better to be on the plus side a little bit. So if we do have a downturn, that we don't have such a severe down, that we have to adjust on the downside to bring the rates back up in the fairly near future on this. I think that maybe this is one of those times that it might be prudent to just keep our powder dry, just sort of sit here a little bit and see what happens over the next term, since we don't have to make a decision right now, and defer that till next summer. Just one man's opinion.
The prudence question I can't answer, because what you're talking about is option one, maintaining the rates that have already been adopted for the 1921 biennium. The piece about the scale of it, though, is if you look at that, what that would mean is, in practical terms, an additional $14 million over the next biennium. And again, 20,000 foot big picture, the $14 million end up being almost insignificant depending on what ends up happening. Would be consistent with some of the decisions that the board has made in the past, where to keep rates stable when the change was fairly small. But also in terms of being prepared for a recession, Ade's point about where you're at in terms of your funding, right now you're at 109, so you've got some protection. We also, right now, as the last valuation, I can't remember the total numbers, but there were more deferred gains on the books than deferred losses. And we haven't got the final audited numbers, I don't think, yet from the SIB for the last fiscal year, but it was better than 7.4, so you can expect a little bit more good news in terms of additional deferred gains probably next year. That's not to say that the 14 million is insignificant, but all three of those pieces that I just mentioned will have a much greater impact than the 14 million.
Just a follow-up, I guess, I don't know, in really generalist terms, the reason I'm even addressing this or have a concern has to do with the fact that you have the longevity of a system, that there's a tipping point somewhere along a system's lifetime to where contributions are overcome by return on investment, and that becomes the major contributor to principal at that point. So your greater income is through that. If that actually is in flex or has the ability to move underneath our feet, is that something that we need to anticipate, or more than just the rate setting aspect, which becomes less and less significant, the longer the system exists?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's no answer for it right now, but that might be a good topic to talk about in October. We think about LEF 2 as being it's been around, those of you who are members, your entire career. There's virtually no active LEF 1 members left. Lisa mentioned earlier we've got a little over 5,000, or maybe it was Tracy mentioned over 5,000 LEF retirees and 17,000 actives. So in terms of actuarial terms, LEF 2 is still not mature yet. And I don't know right now at which you guys are going to kind of hit maturity and what that would look like. But that's something we could sure ask the actuary about, and likely to happen, and how is the world going to look differently at that point in time? That's, for me as a pension nerd, that's an interesting topic to think about.
Steve, go ahead.
I guess one of the other thoughts I've been having is, kind of what Representative Holey was speaking to is, if there is that economic downturn, are we in a better spot if we stick with number one and kind of stay where we're at? But the second point to that is maybe things do continue on well. One of the other original charges that this group has was to enhance benefits. If we do maintain rates and there is no economic downturn, does that keeping the rates where they are actually give us this final opportunity to say, a year or two from now, let's actually enhance the benefits to all of our members, and because we had these rate adjustments, maybe the rates can stay the same, but benefits could increase.
Ade?
Yeah, I think also too, though, one of the issue that will be facing the board as we go along is why some of the employers are hiring retired left. In a way, these are all ways of minimizing cost. And some of the employers in the past few years have been going through so many financial issues. Yes, I totally concur that I think we need to enhance the benefit to the members. But at the same token, we need to consider the cost to the members and to the employers as well, and also to the state. If the board have set the guidelines that we want to be able to have maybe about 110, 109% funding and all of that, and we've met that, shouldn't we consider giving both the employer, the members, and the state a little bit of breathing space, especially during the trying time, without diminishing the benefit to the members?
Mark, go ahead.
So I think so I'll make a motion.
Thank you, brother.
And then we can speak on the motion. I think having run a few union meetings, it's probably a more efficient way to do business. So I'll make a motion that we adopt number 3, and then I'd like to speak to that motion when appropriate.
Motion's been made and seconded. Mark?
So for me, the cost is very close between option 1 and option 3. I think the important thing for me, fiduciary-wise and historically, is to make sure that we make use of the experts. So in this case, the actuary who has said, I think we should include the 217 actuarial valuation in our decision-making process, and I wouldn't want to leave that out of the equation. And I think because of the funding status where we are, I think we're pretty good. So I think we're pretty good with the funded status, and Steve mentioned the earnings are probably going to come in slightly above the assumed rate of return at 7.4. I just want to make sure that we're responsible and we don't create a problem for ourselves politically in the future. So that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you. Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to absolutely support you 100% on this. That was the other side of the coin that we're creating here. For 109% now, a lot of people in the legislature, and Representative Berquist and I have seen this, look simplistically at these numbers. They don't understand the fluctuation, the ebb, the flow. And my gosh, there's money to be had. There's one-time money we can take. You don't need that kind of a thing. If we bump too much above where we're at right now, we may well tend to make ourselves a target too. That would create collateral problems that we're not intending to create. So anything we do here with tunnel vision on, I don't think we see the things that actually we're creating that are issues we'd have to address. So I'm behind you on this, Mark.
Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who to pose this to, maybe you, Steve, or I don't know if Lisa can speak to this on option 3. I agree with Representative Holey. I think it's always important to make sure that we're fulfilling our fiduciary responsibility, but at the same time, we're not becoming a political target for the reasons that Representative Holey just stated. But if we went with option 3 and we did see a political downturn, I know no one has a crystal ball that I know of, what type of vulnerability would option 3 kind of put us in if there was a downturn? Is that something that would take us out of the 30% on our rate scales? Can you speak to that, Steve, or is that maybe
Yeah,
something?
Lisa, you can come on up to, she can give the more specific answer. I kind of touched on this earlier. Based on where you're at, you saw how the market crash in 2008-9 didn't take you out of the corridor, and you're in the same kind of spot now. It would take a correction probably at least on that scale again to make the corridor kind of come into play.
So the good news is that the decision you made earlier today, which would line up with option 3, the 100% normal cost is your rate floor, that number, as Ryan spoke to earlier, doesn't get impacted by investment returns. So that is really a long-term rate for the plan. The reason you're seeing the difference from 875 down to 859, Ryan also spoke to that. That's mainly because we had a change in assumptions. So if you had a market correction, the entry age normal cost would not be impacted by investment returns. It doesn't get impacted by assets. The aggregate, the underlying aggregate would, but you're quite a ways away from that right now at the 859. I think your aggregate rate is somewhere in the mid-sevens, or low, no. 7. It's down, it's in the sevens somewhere. And I also, in listening to this discussion, I also thought it might be helpful. Our office could bring probably in October, if that's a good venue, or November, projections of where we're seeing your contribution rates, both on an expected basis and also with our risk analysis, optimistic and pessimistic paths. So that's something you probably haven't seen for a little while, but we could bring that to you in the fall, and that would also inform these discussions that you're having.
Great. Thank you, Lisa.
Mark, just to make sure I understood too, I know you made this option 3 as your motion. Was the supplemental increase, would that be handled on the outside? Or was that part of your motion? Put that off until some other point?
So basically to ignore the supplemental rate increase would just be to adopt option 3
Correct.
to be effective July.
And then no
If you wanted to do the supplemental, you could still do option 3.
I just want to make
You
sure.
just would jump up that 875 to 88 in September.
I just want to make sure, yeah. Got it.
And the one thing again, historically, the board has adopted it for the next 2 bienniums, so that would be for the 1921 and the 21-23 bienniums. Okay.
All right. Seeing no other discussion, the option 3 has been made and seconded. Discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Option 3 is adopted. You, Ryan?
Thanks.
How do you want to handle number 6? Did you want to do yours now? Or do you want to do number? How would you like to handle that? At 11, what we got? That clock's wrong. I know that. This is about 5 after 11. Let's come back 11:20. Get food, and eat, carry on. Okay. We'll go ahead and get started.
Okay.
All right. Mr. Nelson.
All right, you guys are making good time, so I'm going to do my best not to change that.
Thank you.
As you recall earlier in the interim, Wally announced his resignation from the board. A number of nominees were sent to the governor's office from WACOPS. I was notified yesterday that the governor's office has chosen a new board member, but they haven't been able to notify them yet. So we should know probably within the next day or two who will be Wally's replacement on the board. And then we'll reach out to them and try to get them oriented and ready to go by the September meeting. Expectation interviews, about halfway done. I want to thank all of you that I've already met with and for making the time, and it's been a productive discussion so far. Thank you very much. The Select Committee on Pension Policy met last week. They are going to be, they had a presentations on the 3 issues that Director Guerin spoke about earlier. You'll be talking about those as well here shortly. And then that coordination we will continue. And also on the topic of coordination, I mentioned earlier, DRS has been working with the board on a whole bunch of different issues, whether it's the implementation of legislation, whether it's rulemaking, and they've been very cooperative. So right now, some of the things that are working on, Tracy mentioned the data challenges from some of the employers. A lot of the smaller public hospital districts contracted out their payroll services, and so now getting some of that historic payroll data is proving challenging, but there are options moving forward so that members won't be impacted. They've done a great job of keeping me informed of what issues are arising and what they're doing to manage those issues, so that as I get questions from members, I'm able to either answer them or direct them to the right person at DRS to get their answers. Because there's kind of a lot going on right now, regularly we meet with DRS quarterly, and but right now we're meeting with them monthly to coordinate issues. And then the final thing I wanted to mention with respect to staff outreach, in June, since the last time we met, the State Council of Firefighters had their annual conference in Kennewick, and we had a table there to answer questions from members about the plan while they were at that conference. That is all I have. There is a budget update in your materials as well for the last quarter. I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. Maybe talking a little bit more about, well, anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. But currently, we're under budget for the first year, and with projections, though, for the next year, in order to stay under budget, we're going to have to cut a few things that normally we would do to make sure that we stay under the expenditure authority for the total biennium. With that, are there any questions?
Thank you, Steve. Ryan, do you have a chance to eat? Are you good? All right.
All right. Yes.
Go ahead.
Now, this one's fairly new, so by way of introduction, up in meetings leading up to today, you have had what we call preliminary reports or introductions to a number of different topics that could lead to potential legislation, 10 of them in particular. And the decision before the board will give you a brief update of those 10 issues. Jacob and Ryan and I, brief, but we'd be happy to answer any questions. It's to remind you of the issues and answer any lingering questions that you might have. And then it'll be decision for the board to decide which of the 10 issues you want us to continue working on and bringing back to you for the remainder of the interim. And without too much beyond that, we'll just get right into it. I think there's a handout in your materials that has like a one-sentence summary of each of the 10 issues, and I think we'll be hitting all of those in order.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. Members of the board, again, for the record, Ryan Frost, Senior Research Policy Manager.
And Jacob White, Senior Research and Policy Manager.
And this is the decision on initial reports. The board must determine which initial report issues to receive comprehensive reports on during the 2018 interim. I'll do the first 5, and then Jacob will do 4 of the last 5, with Steve jumping in the middle. And again, we're going to give brief issue statements, discussion on each of these issues. Please, if there's any questions about any of them, jump in at any point. The first issue you heard this interim was the definition of child, and this is the left definition of child excludes children adopted after retirement from the eligibility for benefits. The widow of a Left Plan 1 disability retiree who adopted children after retirement contends that the exclusion of her children is discriminatory and seeks legislation to include the children adopted after the date of retirement within the left definition of child. Are there any questions about that one?
Quickly, is the definition the same for both plans?
It is.
Okay.
The second issue is out-of-state duty. Members who are injured while responding to an emergency out of their jurisdiction are not entitled to left to duty disability or duty death benefits. This issue primarily arose from public safety officers responding to the domestic terrorist attack in Las Vegas and other states proposing industrial insurance coverage for their members that were hurt or killed at that event. The third issue, this was an issue brought forward from last interim as well, is the disabled members' return to work. So disability benefits for members who recover from their disabilities are ambiguous if their previous employer refuses to hire them back. And a couple questions were brought up over the course of the study last year. One, should DRS continue to pay a disability benefit to members who are no longer disabled, even if their employer won't take them back? And should DRS be able to bill the employer for the disability payments they made to the member while they were stuck in that ambiguity period? Currently, DRS has been continuing these disability payments for these members, but that could always change with a change in leadership over there. And so clarification on this issue would be prudent. Any questions on that one? Nope. All right, the fourth one is PEB coverage for catastrophic retirees. Catastrophic disability retirees and their survivors have different and often less medical insurance access than survivors of members killed in the line of duty. They do not have access to benefits through PEB unless they are already receiving PEB benefits through their employer. This coverage was actually part of the initial catastrophic retiree bill, but was taken out after the Healthcare Authority attached a pretty high fiscal note on their expected number of catastrophic disabilities. I believe Paul, he tried to get an updated fiscal note from them last year. He worked with them for a few months, and they ended up not providing it in the end. But if this issue moves forward, that would be something we would want from them. Fifth, standby pay is earnable compensation. Standby pay is not part of basic salary, which is reportable compensation used in computing Left Plan 2 contributions and pensions, but it is reportable compensation for pension purposes in PERS and PSERS.
Career change alternatives. Since the passage of the board's 2005 career change law, multiple issues have surfaced related to the employer's interest in hiring left retirees into left positions. These issues have occurred at the intersection between the career change law, the definitions around left eligibility, and recruitment difficulties, typically in more rural districts. And Senator Van de Wey actually sent a letter to the board during the interim requesting that this issue be looked into. And also in previous legislative sessions, the board has proposed legislation looking at closing what was perceived as loopholes in the current law that has allowed some employers to hire non-LEF employees into positions that were traditionally LEF. So any questions on this? And then survivor option election. It may be considered unfair to have a member make their irrevocable retirement election for a survivor option without all of the information that is important to them. And this issue was brought to the board based off people. So people typically, retirees make their decision based on estimates they receive from DRS. Those are typically very accurate. But occasionally they can be more than 10% off of what someone actually receives. Based off various different factors. Typically, those are based on the employer reporting data after the person has retired or close to them retiring that changes the benefit amount. And at that point, it's too late typically for the member to be able to change their survivor option. So the board, we were discussing either having a window where someone could change their option after they actually receive a check, or creating creating some sort of trigger that would allow them to change their survivor option election. Any questions about that?
For occupational disease benefits, there are certain medical conditions that are presumed to be duty-related for workers' compensation, which also makes them duty-related for Left Plan 2 pension purposes. There was legislation last session that would have expanded coverage of certain duty-related presumptions. The bill did not pass, but may come up again in the next session. Are there any questions about that one?
Okay. And next we have the two DRS bills that DRS presented to the board last month. Both of these were presented to the Select Committee on pension policy also, and the Select Committee voted last month to continue to move these forward. So the first one, spousal consent requirement. So under current law, a member who is retiring under Left Plan 2 must provide written consent from their spouse for any survivorship option the member selects, except in the case of a joint 50% survivor option. This means that a spouse must provide written consent even when his or her survivor benefit would be greater than 50%. And so DRS proposes putting an end to that so that it saves the member time and allows them to apply for retirement electronically without having to get something signed by a notary. And then, any questions on that one? And then month of death retirement payments. In the month a retiree or survivor passes away, DRS prorates the last month benefit payment based on the number of days the person was alive in the month. Frequently this results in an invoice being sent to the family or estate to collect any amount that should have been prorated. So they propose paying the full month benefit. Any questions on that one? No? Okay, thank you.
All right. So again, this is the first time that you guys have done this. This would require board action to move any or all of these 10 items forward. You can move or discuss them individually or as groups. That's all up to you. And if questions arise during your discussion of motion or motions, we're here to help answer those questions.
All right. Mark?
So I'll move that we vote on promoting or moving forward to the next stage, numbers 2, 6, 7, 9, and 10 on the agenda.
Is there a second? Second. Been moved and seconded to move 2, 6, 7, 9, and 10 forward. Discussion? Okay, seeing none. You say something before I...
Just to clarify, that's out of jurisdiction duty, career change alternatives, survivor option election, spousal consent requirement, and month of death retirement payments.
Correct. Ade.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering, the number 8, is there a chance of that coming back to the legislature?
I would.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's,
Can we do more study in order to be relevant and be able to participate in that discussion? Can we have that on the list as well?
Want me to answer? I believe the state council is going to run with that legislation like we did last year. We'll utilize our executive director for information if we need to, but Mike was the go-to person on that bill and got real close. We just had a little snag at the end. So I think we feel pretty good about where we are.
I think, from the labor representative side of things is, as we are looking at upcoming legislative session, the different stakeholder groups are trying to identify what their legislative priorities are going to be. And as Dennis mentioned, certainly for the firefighters, that will be a legislative priority, but it might not be for other stakeholder groups. And, it's kind of a wait and see right now, so.
All right. On the motion, any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? They're adopted. Thank you. Just a question for you, Steve. The number 3 item, the disabled members return to work,
yes.
is that, at what point would we, I know it's important, all of them, these are important items, but at what point would that rise up? Like Ryan mentioned, if they had a change maybe in their leadership, or, because right now they're paying for it, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so can you touch on that?
Yes. So specifically the issue is under pension law, when a member recovers from a duty-related disability, there is a requirement that the employer take them back at their original job. Situations have come up where DRS has determined that a person has recovered from their disability, but the employer disagrees with that determination and refuses to hire the member back. So that creates what Ryan was talking to about ambiguity. What happens when DRS and the employer disagree about whether or not a member is disabled? Currently, DRS is continuing to pay disability retirement benefits to members in that situation until it's determined whether or not they are in fact disabled and they're rehired or not. But the statutes on that point aren't 100% clear. So this wasn't DRS request legislation, but it did come up during the course of developing rules with DRS as an area where some statutory clarification to support their current practice might be helpful. Absent that, there is the possibility that a change in philosophy over at DRS at some point in time in the future, they might decide not to.
Right. And at that point, we could weigh in as a group.
Yep.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Patrick.
Thank you. As one of the employer reps sitting here, prior to me becoming a rep, we dealt with this issue, and now that I am a commissioner, we've had discussions because some departments have talked as they do, and sometimes they talk out of school, and they shouldn't. But it helps sometimes to see what people's motivations are. And some departments use this, the disability, to not return an employee back to work, not because they're not fit, they just don't want the employee back. And they're using it as a tool to hammer them. And one even made a point to mention that we should be talking to DRS to cut off their disability payments. And so at this time, I voted for the options that we're looking at, but I believe this is one that we may want to wade in maybe next year or so to start working with them, because Somebody that's injured and is off is one thing. It's another thing to be using that when that person is cleared to come back to work and has a career and is not being able to continue that career just because a fire chief or a police chief uses their authority not to bring them back. If the employee is a problem employee, they should be handled as a problem employee, not to have them not reinstated just because they found an option to keep them off the books. And I think that is wrong, and especially from an employer side, because the disability payments that are being made or anything that's being paid, I'm still paying for it as an employer. So I think maybe we want to look into that next year if we can.
Hey. Right, number 8 is the agenda items for future meetings.
Based on the action that you just took, we'll come back and adjust the September meeting agenda to have follow-ups on those 5 options. Given the 5, the board earlier in the year when you were setting up your interim plan, you left the August meeting open, and I don't feel from a workload standpoint that you need to have the August meeting. So if there was a motion to cancel that meeting, then we would send out formal notice to the code revisor that the meeting was canceled.
Which would be a good time to make that motion now.
Yeah, if you want to make that now.
Jason?
Mr. Chair, motion to cancel August meeting.
Second. Motion's been made and seconded to cancel our August 22nd meeting. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? We are canceled. And you'll take care of all that notification. Right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And then we'll have comprehensive reports on the 5 topics that you just mentioned, beginning in September, with the idea that if any of them move forward, there could be further discussion at the November and December meetings. For the remainder of the interim, you've got kind of 2 things going on in addition to those 5 comprehensive reports. The October 24th offsite for strategic planning, and then separate and apart from that, you've got some actuarial items that will require attention, and some are information, some are action, specifically adoption of the administrative factors for some of the benefits that came out of the changes in the economic assumptions. And then we'll be bringing you back the results of some of the additional benefit pricing exercise updates. And the actuary will also have a demographic experience preview before the end of the year. You'll have your annual update from the State Investment Board, and you'll have the benchmarking presentation from DRS. So that's the plan for the remainder of the interim. Are there any questions about any of those topics, or anything that you felt might have been left off?
Just one thing. Most of us, and this is on the executive report, most of us wear ties when we come here. And I was wondering, did you have a rash, Mr. Director?
You know,
If he was from our side, I'd tell him to leave, but he's not, so I got to sit and listen to him.
and I knew this was coming as soon as you joined the board.
Yeah.
But no, I will maintain attire appropriate with the board at future meetings.
I'd like to thank Pat for those nice comments again. Just asking.
Representative Berquist like the comments?
Yeah. And I told Ade he was a smart one because I got a tie on. So, all right. Enough of our fashion faux pas. Yeah. All right. Anything else before our group? We will adjourn to executive session, and I think for the purpose, and I think we've got it wrote down here just to make sure, to matters provided by law, final, okay, hold on, make sure I got my.
There are
What's it? You
two
got it.
purposes.
You got it for me right there.
To review the performance of a state employee and/or to discuss past legal advice on the benefit improvement account.
We'll be discussing that issue.
And then we can,
There'll be no action taken afterwards, correct? We will be, as far as votes.
well, that'll be up to you at that time,
We need about 30 minutes.
okay?
Yeah.
So
12.
adjourned until, until 12:30 and then reconvene back here at 12:30.
Sounds good.
We've got the small conference room over there available? Yes.
For those of you out there, we don't envision any action being taken, so it's more updates and information, so. All right, so we'll be, I guess, in recess, correct? Yes. Recess till 12:30.
Mr. Chair, I move that we adjourn.